What happens when Hollywood's most intense method actor meets one of the industry's most outspoken political voices on live television, and things go completely off the rails? Today, we're diving into the moment Tom Cruise absolutely dismantled Jane Fonda on The View in what has to be one of the most uncomfortable celebrity interviews ever recorded. Before we get into this train wreck, make sure you subscribe and drop a comment below because this story has more twists than a Mission Impossible plot. The setup seemed innocent enough. Tom Cruise was making his promotional rounds for his latest action blockbuster, and the View producers thought it would be great television to have him sit down with the panel. What they didn't anticipate was Jane Fonda being in one of her particularly confrontational moods that day. From the moment Cruise walked onto that set, you could feel the tension crackling through the studio. Whoopi Goldberg started things off with typical softball questions about the new movie, the stunts, the preparation. Cruise was in his element, that trademark intensity and enthusiasm on full display. "The thing about this character," he said, leaning forward with that piercing stare, "is that he represents something real. He's someone who doesn't back down from what's right, no matter what the cost." That's when Jane Fonda decided to make her move. She had been sitting there with this smirk on her face, clearly waiting for her moment to pounce. "That's interesting, Tom," she interrupted, her voice dripping with condescension. "Because I have to wonder about someone who talks so much about what's right when they're part of an organization that has such a questionable track record with transparency." The camera caught Cruise's expression shifting in real time. That friendly, promotional smile flickered for just a second before he composed himself. But anyone who knows Tom Cruise knows that when he gets that particular look in his eyes, things are about to get very real very quickly. Whoopi tried to jump in with a redirect. "Well, let's talk about the action sequences in the film," she said, clearly sensing where this was heading, but Fonda wasn't having it. "No, I think this is important," Fonda continued, that self-righteous tone getting stronger. "Here we have someone who presents himself as this all-American hero on screen, but in real life, he's deeply involved with an organization that former members have described as controlling and manipulative. Don't you think the public deserves some honesty about that?" The studio audience was dead silent. You could practically hear a pin drop. The other hosts were shifting uncomfortably in their seats, clearly wishing they were anywhere else. But Cruise, to his credit, didn't lose his cool. Instead, he did something that caught everyone completely off guard. He started laughing, not a nervous laugh or a defensive chuckle, but this genuine, almost amused laugh that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside. "Jane," he said, shaking his head with what looked like pity, "I have to say, this is probably the most hypocritical thing I've heard in a very long time." Fonda's confident expression faltered slightly. She clearly wasn't expecting that response. "Excuse me?" she said, her voice rising an octave. "You want to talk about questionable organizations and transparency?" Cruise continued, his voice steady but with an edge that was becoming more apparent with each word. "You want to talk about people who present themselves as one thing while being something completely different? Jane, you literally traveled to North Vietnam during a war where American soldiers were dying, and you posed for propaganda photos with the enemy, and now you want to lecture me about patriotism and honesty?" The studio erupted into uncomfortable murmurs. Fonda's face went pale, then flushed red. "That was a different time," she stammered, clearly caught off guard by the directness of his response. "That was about ending a senseless war." "A different time?" Cruise repeated, his intensity ramping up in that way that makes his performances so captivating. "Jane, those weren't just statistics. Those were real people. Real families who lost sons and daughters while you were providing comfort to the people shooting at them. And you want to question my character?" Joy Behar tried to jump in. "Maybe we should take a step back here," she suggested weakly. But the train had already left the station, and there was no stopping it now. Fonda, clearly feeling cornered, decided to double down instead of backing off. "At least I had the courage to stand up for what I believed in," she shot back, her voice getting sharper. At least I wasn't hiding behind some cult-like organization that controls every aspect of my life and tells me what to think. That was the moment everything changed. Cruise's demeanor shifted completely. The Hollywood charm vanished, and what emerged was something much more dangerous. This wasn't the smooth media-trained movie star anymore. This was someone who had just been pushed too far. Cult-like organization? He repeated slowly, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. Jane, let me tell you something about courage. Courage isn't flying to enemy territory for a photo opportunity. Courage isn't grandstanding for the cameras while real heroes are dying in rice paddies. Courage is taking responsibility for your actions and living with the consequences, something you've apparently never learned how to do. The audience was completely silent now. Even the camera operators seemed frozen, unsure whether they should keep rolling or cut away. This had gone from a simple promotional interview to something much more intense, much more personal. Fonda tried to regain control of the situation. I'm not going to sit here and be lectured by someone who, she began, but Cruise cut her off mid-sentence. No, Jane, you are going to sit there and listen, because for once in your life, someone is going to tell you the truth without worrying about your feelings or your reputation. His voice was rising now, that famous intensity building like a pressure cooker about to explode. You want to talk about organization? Let's talk about how you've spent decades lecturing everyone else about morality while conveniently forgetting your own mistakes. The words hit Fonda like a physical blow. You could see her recoil slightly in her chair, her confident facade cracking more with each passing second. But Cruise wasn't done. He was just getting started. You know what really bothers me about people like you, Jane? He continued, leaning forward with that laser focus that made him such a compelling actor. You think that because you apologize once or twice in some carefully crafted interviews, that somehow erases the damage you did. You think that because you've reinvented yourself as this feminist icon, everyone should just forget that you gave aid and comfort to people who were literally torturing American prisoners of war. Whoopi Goldberg made one more attempt to steer the conversation elsewhere. Tom, maybe we could talk about your upcoming projects, she suggested, her voice strained with desperation. But Cruise ignored her completely. His attention was laser-focused on Fonda, who was now looking genuinely shaken. And the worst part, he continued, is that you've never really owned up to what you did. You've made excuses, you've rationalized it, you've tried to rewrite history to make yourself look better. But you've never just said, I was wrong, I hurt people, and I'm truly sorry. Fonda's hands were trembling slightly as she reached for her water glass. I have apologized, she said weakly, her earlier bravado completely gone. I've said many times that I regret. Regret, Cruise interrupted, his voice cutting through her words like a knife. You regret it, like it was some minor social faux pas. Jane, do you have any idea what it was like for the families of those prisoners to see you smiling and laughing with their captors? Do you have any concept of the betrayal those soldiers felt when they saw those pictures? The camera kept cutting between their faces, capturing every micro-expression, every moment of tension. Fonda looked like she wanted to disappear into her chair, while Cruise looked like he was just hitting his stride. But here's what really gets me, he continued, his voice building in intensity again. After all of that, after all the damage you caused, you have the audacity to sit here and attack my beliefs, my choices, my integrity. You want to talk about organizations that control people? You've been controlled by your own ego and your need to be seen as relevant for so long that you've lost touch with basic human decency. Joy Behar finally found her voice. Tom, I think you're being a little harsh, she said, though her tone suggested she wasn't entirely convinced of her own words. Cruise turned to her with that same intense stare. Harsh? Joy, let me ask you something. If someone in your family had been captured in Vietnam, and they were being tortured, and they managed to survive and come home, how do you think they would feel about Jane's little publicity stunt? Would you tell them they were being too harsh for being angry about it? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Joy opened her mouth to respond, but seemed to realize she didn't have a good answer. The silence stretched uncomfortably before Cruise turned back to Fonda. You know what the real tragedy is here, Jane? You could have been a force for good. You had a platform, you had influence, you had the ability to make a real difference. But instead of using that responsibly, you chose to become a symbol of everything that's wrong with celebrity activism. You chose personal publicity over genuine principle. Fonda finally found some of her voice again, though it was noticeably weaker than before. That's not fair, she protested. I've spent my life fighting for important causes, women's rights, environmental issues, social justice. Fighting for causes, Cruise repeated mockingly. Jane, showing up at a few rallies and making speeches isn't fighting. You know what fighting is? It's the guys who were getting shot at in the jungle while you were posing for pictures with the people shooting at them. It's the families who kept believing their sons and husbands would come home while you were giving propaganda victories to the enemy. The studio audience was completely captivated now. This wasn't just a celebrity spat anymore. This was a genuine confrontation between two completely different worldviews, and everyone in the room could feel the weight of it. Fonda tried a different approach, attempting to regain some moral high ground. At least I've evolved. At least I've grown from my mistakes. Can you say the same? Are you going to sit there and tell me that your organization hasn't made any mistakes? That there aren't people who have been hurt? It was a desperate move, trying to redirect the conversation back to Cruise's beliefs, but he was ready for it. In fact, he seemed almost pleased that she had brought it up again. You want to talk about evolution, Jane? Let me tell you about evolution. Evolution is taking responsibility for your actions without making excuses. Evolution is admitting when you're wrong without trying to justify why you were wrong. Evolution is understanding that some things can't be undone, and the best you can do is try to live better going forward. His voice was getting stronger, more passionate. But what you've done isn't evolution, it's image rehabilitation. You've spent decades trying to rewrite history, trying to make people forget what you really did, trying to position yourself as some kind of wise elder stateswoman who learned from her mistakes. But wisdom isn't about learning to spin your failures better, it's about understanding the true cost of those failures. Fonda was looking genuinely distraught now. You don't know what you're talking about, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. You don't know what it was like back then. The pressure, the confusion. The confusion? Cruise shot back immediately. Jane, let me clear up any confusion for you. When your country is at war and your countrymen are dying, you don't fly to the enemy capital and pose for propaganda photos. That's not confusing. That's basic human decency. Cruise paused for a moment, seeming to gather himself before delivering what would become the most devastating part of his response. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, but somehow more intense than before. You know what really bothers me about this whole conversation, Jane? It's not just what you did. It's how you've handled it ever since. You've made a career out of being the victim. Poor Jane. She was young and idealistic. Poor Jane. She was manipulated by the anti-war movement. Poor Jane. Everyone was so mean to her when she was just trying to help. Fonda's face had gone completely white. That's not, she started, but Cruise wasn't finished. But here's the truth that you've never been willing to face. You weren't a victim in Vietnam. Those prisoners were victims. Those families were victims. Those soldiers who came home to find out that a Hollywood actress had been giving propaganda victories to their captors, they were victims. You? You were just someone who made a choice and didn't want to deal with the consequences. The silence in the studio was deafening. Even the camera operator seemed afraid to move, as if any sudden sound might break whatever spell was holding this moment together. And now, Cruise continued, his voice building again. Decades later, you want to sit here and lecture me about making questionable choices? You want to question my integrity? Jane, you have spent more time trying to rehabilitate your image than you ever spent actually considering the damage you caused. You've become a professional victim, and that's somehow supposed to give you the moral authority to judge other people? Fonda tried one more time to mount a defense. I was trying to end a war that was killing people, she said desperately. I was trying to bring attention to something that was wrong. No, Cruise said firmly, leaning forward with that intense stare that could cut through steel. You were trying to get attention, period. If you really wanted to end the war, there were 1,000 ways to do that without giving aid and comfort to the enemy. But those ways wouldn't have gotten you on the front page of every newspaper in the world, would they? The accusation hung in the air like a thunderbolt. Fonda looked like she had been physically struck. Her mouth opened and closed a few times, but no words came out. You want to know the difference between your choices and mine? Cruise pressed on relentlessly. My choices are about trying to help people, trying to make things better, trying to contribute something positive to the world. Your choice in Vietnam was about making yourself the center of attention in someone else's tragedy. And that's exactly what you're trying to do here today. Whoopi made one last desperate attempt to restore some semblance of control. Maybe we should all take a breath here, she suggested weakly. But Cruise was in full flow now, and there was no stopping him. You know what I find most telling about this whole exchange, Jane? You started this conversation by attacking my beliefs, my choices, my integrity. You came in here with your talking points all prepared, ready to make me look bad on national television. But the moment someone turned the spotlight back on you, the moment someone asked you to account for your own actions, you completely fell apart. He paused, letting that sink in before delivering the final blow. That tells me everything I need to know about your character. It's easy to throw stones when you think you're in a position of moral superiority. It's a lot harder when someone reminds you that your own house is made of glass. Fonda looked absolutely devastated. Her earlier confidence was completely gone, replaced by something that looked almost like shame. She seemed to shrink into her chair, unable to meet Cruise's gaze or the cameras. And here's what really makes me sad about all of this, Cruise continued, his voice softening slightly but losing none of its intensity. You could have used this moment differently. You could have acknowledged your past mistakes honestly, shown some genuine remorse, maybe even used your platform to actually help people instead of just attacking them. But instead, you chose to come in here and try to tear someone else down to make yourself feel better. The camera captured Fonda's face in that moment, and it was clear that something inside her had broken. The fight was completely gone out of her. She looked like someone who had just realized that all her carefully constructed defenses had crumbled in a matter of minutes. That's what people like you never understand, Cruise said, his voice now carrying a tone of genuine disappointment. Real strength isn't about attacking other people. Real courage isn't about making yourself look good by making others look bad. Real integrity is about owning your mistakes and trying to do better. Not about spending decades making excuses and pointing fingers. Joy Behar made a weak attempt to defend Fonda. Jane has done a lot of good work over the years, she said, though her heart clearly wasn't in it. Cruise turned to her with that same penetrating stare. Has she? Or has she just done a lot of work that makes her look good? Because there's a big difference between actually helping people and just appearing to help people for the cameras. He turned back to Fonda, who was now staring at her hands in her lap. Jane, I want you to think about something. When you go home tonight, when you're alone with your thoughts, I want you to ask yourself one question. In all these years, in all these interviews, in all these public appearances where you've talked about your mistakes in Vietnam, have you ever, even once, thought about those prisoners and their families as real people rather than just obstacles to your image rehabilitation? The question hit like a physical blow. Fonda visibly flinched, and for a moment, it looked like she might actually cry. The studio was so quiet, you could hear the air conditioning humming. Because that's what this is really about, Cruise continued mercilessly. This isn't about politics or organizations or who's right and who's wrong. This is about basic human empathy. This is about understanding that your actions have consequences for real people, not just for your career or your reputation. He leaned back in his chair, his point made. So, before you come after anyone else, before you question anyone else's choices or integrity or beliefs, Maybe you should spend some time examining your own. Maybe you should figure out whether you're actually trying to help people or just trying to make yourself feel better about the things you've done wrong. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Fonda sat there, completely defeated, unable to respond to what had just happened. The other hosts looked around desperately, clearly hoping someone else would figure out how to end this nightmare. Finally, Whoopi found her voice. "Well," she said, her tone strained, "this has certainly been an interesting conversation. Tom, thank you for being here." But Cruise wasn't quite done. He looked directly into the camera with that intensity that had made him one of the biggest movie stars in the world. "The truth is, people can attack my beliefs, my choices, my lifestyle all they want. But at the end of the day, I can sleep at night knowing that I've never betrayed my country, I've never given aid and comfort to enemies, and I've never spent decades making excuses for inexcusable behavior. And I think that's a pretty good place to start any conversation about integrity." With that, he stood up, shook Whoopi's hand politely, nodded to the other hosts, and walked off the set, leaving behind what was probably the most uncomfortable moment in daytime television history. Fonda sat there for a few more seconds, still staring at her hands, before finally looking up at the camera with an expression of complete defeat. The woman who had started the interview ready for battle had been absolutely dismantled, and everyone watching knew it. So there you have it, one of the most brutal celebrity confrontations ever captured on live television. Tom Cruise didn't just defend himself, he completely exposed Jane Fonda's hypocrisy and left her with no way to respond. Make sure to subscribe for more incredible celebrity moments like this. And let me know in the comments, do you think Cruise went too far? Or did Fonda get exactly what she deserved?